This week on Life and Faith.
If people realized that they had a common enemy, one who thrives on all this hatred that they feel for each other, it might bring some peace because we're feeding that entity, that evil. And it's not on our side. It's not on either side. It's against us all.
All these things are suddenly changing.
One of your own countrymen, Nick Cave, is quite an interesting example here.
Ethical foods tend to be a lot more expensive.
My mother had a serious illness.
It might seem as if the entirety of the cosmos was a bit of a put-up job.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Well, how do we explain evil in the world? Does the devil exist? Now, these are not exactly icebreakers in polite conversation or things we generally talk about in a scientific age, which often dismisses talk of the supernatural as fantasy or fairy tale. But these questions make for a fascinating study into the origins and presence and persistence of evil in the modern West.
Yes, and you've just seen Dracula, like a stage production.
Yeah, it was at the Sydney Theatre Company, incredible stage production of Dracula last night, actually, Justine. And it was amazing. And it does bring up this topic that we're going to be talking about today, but the idea of evil, the presence of it, its relationship to each of us, the extent to which we resist it and maybe welcome it on occasion. It was very, very interesting. And interesting to me that this old story still captivates people so powerfully. Now, The Devil's Best Trick, How the Face of Evil Disappeared, is a book written by author Randall Sullivan. Now, he's a guy who clearly has his own strange and compelling backstory with faith. And Justine, you interviewed him for this episode. I'm so looking forward to this. But tell me, first of all, how did you first come across this book?
I saw it reviewed in the New York Times, which itself is quite interesting. I generally wouldn't expect a book about the devil to make its way into those pages. But Randall's worked for Rolling Stone on and off for 20 years or so. He's done a lot of narrative long-form journalism, as well as written all these great, fabulous non-fiction books as well. So in a way, I suppose he straddles the sacred-secular divide, which I think makes this book really unique and interesting. This book is not a work of history, nor is it a work of theology, but he does go into both of those areas. So again, very interesting that this should appear in the New York Times. This book is more an investigative deep dive, if I can put it this way, into basically the devil and his works.
This is going to be so interesting, but I think it's safe to say, Justine, then this is not really an episode for little kids.
Do not let them anywhere near it. This book and this interview is grappling with the presence of evil and also what Sullivan feels are the entirely insufficient explanations of evil that we modern people come up with. Now, I need to just tell you also that in this interview, we're not going to cover some aspects of his book that are incredible, and I feel like I need to mention just to give you a scope of what he's covering. We don't go into the human sacrifice practiced by the Aztecs, nor do we go into the black masses in Mexico that he attended, but we do talk a bit about the murder of a teenage boy in small-town America, thought to be the result of a satanic cult, and we'll get to that after the break. But before we jump into this book, we need to begin with Randall's conversion to Catholicism, because in a way, it leads to this book. While on assignment as a war correspondent for Rolling Stone in Bosnia-Herzegovina, he has this mountaintop conversion experience that he later writes about in The Miracle Detective. Now, that book was Randall's deep dive into religious visions and how they get investigated by the Catholic Church. So just to set up his story, it's 1995 and he's in Medjugorje in Bosnia-Herzegovina. As I said, there to cover the war, but also curious about these visions and conversations that 6 young people have started having with the Virgin Mary. Okay, this is the setup. And he has this tense discussion with one of those visionaries. And as she's talking to him, she can sense that Randall is on the fence, spiritually speaking. So they have a bit of a confrontation and she basically tells him to get out of her house and go to the Cross Mountain, which is nearby. So he leaves her house, heads towards the mountain, It's crazy hot. The sun is beating down. There's no one else around. And here's what happens next.
I got maybe a quarter of the way up the mountain when out of a completely blue sky, a knot of black clouds formed right over my head. The oddest thing about it is I could look in every direction and it was still sunshine. But right over my head was this knot of black clouds that began to drop astounding lightning bolts and deafening thunder. And it just seemed so personal, so personally directed at me that I felt overwhelmed with terror and as if, wow, there is a God and he's telling me I better pay attention. So I was so deeply shaken that I wasn't sure what to do, but I had this sort of determination that I was just going to keep going. Rain began to fall, so I was getting soaked and wearing virtually nothing. All of a sudden, I began to hear some singing in French. And so I moved toward that sound because I was desperate for some contact. And there were a group of nuns kneeling and praying. The mountain was laid out in stations of the cross, and I think this was the fourth station of the cross. They were kneeling and praying, and I joined them. I got down on my knees and prayed with them and felt tremendous comfort from being in their company. And so we continued up the mountain that way, stopping and praying at each station of the cross. And each time I kneeled and prayed, I felt, more and more connected to God. And it became a completely overwhelming experience. By the time I got to the top of the mountain, I was in total terror because this storm was unbelievably violent and it seemed like it was completely directed at me. And all of a sudden, I felt, sort of this direct communication, and it was, basically God or Jesus laughing, not at me so much as with me, like, do you really think I intended to hurt you? And so I just went into this. Well, I started laughing myself. After the laugh, this young woman approached who I hadn't seen before. I hadn't seen her with the nuns before, but I just assumed she had been with them and I just hadn't seen her. And she walked up and placed a cloth across my shoulders and a hat on my head as if to keep me dry and warm. And then I just lost, for some time, consciousness of the world outside, what I was feeling. But when I came out of it, the clouds were gone, the sun was shining again, but the nuns were gone, and the young woman was gone, and I was alone on the mountain. I literally sprinted down the mountain because I knew I'd catch them before they could get to the bottom, but there was no one. And there was only one way up or down the mountain. And when I got down to the very bottom, there was a little, shack that sold refreshments. And I said, did a group of nuns go by here? No, you've been the only one who's gone up the mountain today. So I was just, I don't know what I was, but I had this cloth and the hat. So I had like a physical, this is real. So I ran to the top of the mountain again, thinking I missed them somewhere. They weren't there. So finally I came back down and I laid the cloth and the hat on a rock at the bottom of the mountain and walked back into town, changed by it. Another affirmation that this wasn't, as Oprah Winfrey asked me, a hallucination, was that all of the people in town were talking about this incredible thunderstorm. Never seen anything, it was this amazing event. So I knew something real had happened, and then when I told people I'd been on the mountain when it happened, without giving them any details, they were all very impressed, and that's just remarkable. And so anyway, it was like something I couldn't go back from. That's how it felt.
Yeah. You've mentioned Oprah, and I can imagine she would take in that experience and roll with it. But I wonder
not entirely.
Not entirely?
No, she asked me if I might have been hallucinating, and she was actually a very tough questioner on the subject.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's unfair then to pitch Oprah as less tough than perhaps your Rolling Stone editor. She was hey, Randall, how was your trip? And you're like, actually, this is what happened. Or did you not feel like you could say?
I didn't feel like I could share that experience with them, although I knew I was going to write about it. I knew I had no choice but to write about it. But I did tell them that something had happened to me there and that I'd become a Catholic, that I'd I'd been given sort of a 15-minute official conversion to Catholic by the Franciscan priest there, and received the sacraments, and that this had happened to me, and I wasn't the same. And really, the editor didn't want to hear a lot about it anyway, and it made him nervous, but he did say after some time, you actually seem like a nicer person. I thought, well, so maybe some good happened.
We've got so much ground to cover here, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. Now we go from Randall's ecstatic mountaintop experience to something far more sinister not long after. On his way back to the US, Randall finds himself in Rome.
When I got to Rome, I couldn't get a flight back to the US, at least where I wanted to go, for several days. So it was brutally hot. So I went to the Piazza Navona, which is where whenever I'm in Rome and it's hot, I tend to go there to cool off. So I was kind of standing, catching a little of the mist, and all of a sudden I saw this gent walking toward me. That's what I thought when I saw him, quite the gent, because he was very dressed up with a cravat, these highly polished shoes, beautiful clothing. But as he got a little closer, I was really disturbed by his expression. It was just there was this malevolence in it. Malevolent drollery is how I described it in the book, and that's what it was. It was like he was sort of sneering, laughing, but with this malevolent intent, and I was sort of seized. He seized my attention with that, and then he began to talk really loudly in some language that wasn't Italian. I don't know what it was to this day. But there were people all around us, T-shirt hawkers, people selling balloons, ice cream, whatever. People all around, and nobody seemed to notice him. And he was making this huge commotion. So I stood there watching him walk toward me. And all of a sudden, I grabbed this religious medal that I had taken to wearing, something actually my mother had given to me long ago, but I never wore it. But in Medjugorje, I started wearing a scapular medal, it's called. And I clutched it, and I looked at him, and I said, "You can't touch me." And whatever this language he was speaking, he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'll catch you later." And then he just kept going. So people have said, well, Sullivan claims to have met the devil on the piazza. I don't know who or what it was. It didn't seem human. It was terrifying in retrospect, and other people terrified by hearing it. But I felt incredible calm because I felt, you can't touch me unless I let you touch me. That was just really clear to me that, this creature couldn't do anything if I didn't let him in. And for whatever reason, I felt afterward that like I was somehow being pushed or called or compelled to write something about the devil. And people who read The Miracle Detective, some of them were saying, you need to go into that deeper. I didn't want to exactly, but because I felt this sort of push or pressure, I signed a contract to write a book, then took almost 20 years to write. I wrote 6 other books in the interim, trying to avoid finishing The Devil's Best Trick, but ultimately a point came when I knew I had to, so I did.
Randall gets that the question of evil is a hard sell for modern people who don't buy the existence of the supernatural. It's partly why he included the disturbing stories, in a book filled with them, of Wesley Allen Dodd and Lawrence Bittaker, 2 serial killers on death row, whose depraved acts I will not go into.
Even before encountering these 2, I was surrounded by, reporters who were calling them sick. And I remember thinking, I can't call this sick. It's beyond sick. This isn't some disease that someone's going to treat and cure. This is the only word to describe it was evil. But even at that time, I couldn't bring myself to use the word, and they would never have used it. But I've realized in retrospect that the inability of so many educated, supposedly sophisticated people to recognize evil for what it is, that was essentially how these 2 were able to do what they did. The system caught them. Many times they could have been stopped, but the system was set up to see them as sick. And they were far beyond that, either of them. They were purely evil, and they were going to do evil things, no matter what. the only thing that could be done with him was to separate them. So it was the inability to recognize evil when it was right in their faces of these people who had a chance to really struck me as the epitome of how we've stupefied ourselves or numbed ourselves to the reality that's right in front of us. I mean, evil exists. Evil is a fact. Evil must come from somewhere. Immanuel Kant thought about this deeply and realized, this universe would be a perfectly functioning mechanism. I'd almost be able to accept the blind watchmaker view of God or something like that, except evil. Evil is this radical departure that has no explanation other than that there is some force of evil, some spiritual force of evil that's in the universe. So I think that if we blind ourselves to that, if we think things can be defined in terms of culture or systems, that there's any psychological explanation of evil, ultimately, we're deluding ourselves.
I know this comes from a different part in the book. I'm just going to get to it. I think it's when you're describing the exorcism that you witnessed at the youth festival. Yeah. And when you describe the exorcism that took place in front of you, there's a line that you say, "I became utterly convinced that something was leaving her, that what I had just witnessed was not emotional or psychological or imaginary, but real," whatever that meant. And I thought that was a brilliant sentence because it really sums up all the explanations we reach for when we're grappling with something that we don't quite understand. Oh, it's an emotional thing that experienced on the mountaintop. It could be a psychological, or you were hallucinating.
Or a hallucination, right? Which, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, but I have to recognize, and I wish other people would too, that they're just trivializing the experience and even their own experiences or their unexperienced experiences. And it is difficult for any of us who've had these mystical experiences. And I haven't, I'm not a mystic. I haven't continued to have these. I had a few that have come to me completely out of nowhere. I mean, they just happened. But when I think of Bill Maher or somebody, I'd say this too, you're passing judgment on something you've never experienced and don't understand, but you're trying to scorn something mainly because you've never experienced it. So because you've been too closed off to ever actually experience something like that, you say it doesn't exist. And you're going to project that it doesn't exist belief onto me and to other people. But it's really shallow of you. It's your deficit that we're talking about. It's not the experience itself. You just don't know what we're talking about.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're hearing from Justine's interview with Randall Sullivan, author of The Devil's Best Trick: How the Face of Evil Disappeared. If you enjoy true crime, then you'll be fascinated by one case study in particular that Randall examines: the death of Tate Rowland, a popular 16-year-old boy found hanging from a horseapple tree in Childress, a small town in Texas, back in 1998. Here's Randall to tell that story.
It was initially ruled a suicide, even though there was obvious physical evidence that contradicted that. But we're talking about rural cops who really, didn't make much of an attempt to investigate until, later. But because of other things that had happened and things that people had found, the idea that this had been the product of a satanic cult spread through the town. And there were certainly substantial pieces of evidence to support it. But at the same time, it became a town where everybody was seeing it around every corner and in every neighbor. So you had all these people pointing at each other and accusing each other, and this satanic panic. But it was almost as if the satanic panic covered up the fact that there was some sort of satanic element to this. I mean, I think the evidence of that is pretty strong, although it was never nothing was ever fully resolved in that regard, which was kind of part of it too, is that the devil gets away with it. But I really felt when I was in that town and talking to all these people and, reliving it with them, that the consciousness that was probably most delighted by the satanic panic and everyone getting into a frenzy and seeing the devil around every corner was the devil himself, because that has probably done more to convince people there is no devil than any other phenomenon. I mean, the witch craze, the witch hunts of the 16th century were all the way up to the satanic panic in the 1980s. It's those periods that have, in the aftermath of those periods, where belief in the devil has declined significantly and people think it was all just this hysteria. I was drawn into that story because of a woman I knew who, without getting too far into it, she's a famous bounty hunter and investigator, and I was with her on a case, and I was writing an article for Wired magazine. But suddenly, as we were waiting to find this guy, it was hiding on a yacht on a bayou in Louisiana, ultimately, when we found him. We started talking about evil as a reality, and she said she was convinced of it, and she was convinced that there was such a thing as Satanism. And it was because of this experience she'd had where this girl moved into her town, began to tell her all these stories about something they'd done that had ended with a boy being hung from a tree. My friend Michelle was so affected by it, even though she was a teenage girl at the time, that she started drawing pictures of what the other girl was telling her and took them to the police department, who sent them to the police department in West Texas, who looked at it and said, these are perfect pictures of crime scenes we've had here. So, they brought Michelle and, it kind of amped up investigation of the case and of this satanic group. And well, they turned up a lot, and the two most superior law enforcement officers that I talked to about this, who investigated the case, were both convinced that there was some sort of satanic group that was part of what had happened. But, they could only get pieces of evidence, never enough to nail it down or even to declare Tate's death a murder. But they believed it was a murder. Eventually, his sister was killed. And actually, someone was convicted of her murder. And she was supposedly investigating Tate's death when that happened. But, there was an inconclusive aspect to it. But it was kind of really more about this town, becoming consumed with this satanic panic and how it did immense damage to the town and to relationships. But it also sort of created a smokescreen, a cover that allowed whoever had been involved in this to disappear. And that was what made it such a fascinating study to me.
Tell me, what have been the reactions of particularly skeptical people to these books?
Well, there's a range of reactions, but I mean, hardcore skeptics, people that are convinced that to even use the word evil is inappropriate, have been, I'd say, pretty unsympathetic to the book and to me. And, I have been basically accused of being a Christian. I mean, the Washington Post accused me of being a Christian.
What a charge.
Yeah. Well, the New York Times kind of accused me of being a Christian, but they wrote a rave review of the book.
Yeah, they loved it. I read that one.
So you never know. I mean, so it was a mixed response. But I mean, the viciousness of some of the negative people, as it startled me. It's like, I knew I was writing a polarizing book. I knew I'm putting myself out there and people are going to react in all kinds of ways. But I remember when the Washington Post review was published, there was a long conversation online, and the viciousness of these people, the anti-Christian vitriol and just rage was startling to me.
Yeah.
But I mean, really, the review, basically the fundamental accusation was that you're too white, you're too Western, and you're especially too Christian. So
these things are not in fashion today. No.
Yeah.
I wonder, though, whether if a Gen Z audience picks this up, they might run with it in a way that's very surprising. I believe that as a generation, they are far more open to spiritual phenomena than older generations. And so I'm curious to see how this book is received by that generation. Of course, it is perhaps also possible to be a bit too open. You were saying that evil is there and you can't touch me unless you invite it into you. So that might be something for younger audiences to grapple with as well.
What you just said reminds me when Michelle and I were in Mexico in this very scary environment. We were deep in the Mexican jungle in the center of witchcraft, black magic, and devil worship in Mexico. And at one point, even though Michelle was constantly terrified we were going to be killed by the Zetas, the Federales, all the people.
And she's the bounty hunter.
The number of times she said, "Oh, you've gotten us killed." But when we actually agreed to attend a black mass together, not participate, but watch it, she said, "No, I'm not worried because evil can't get into you unless you let it into you, and I'm not letting it into me." And she said it with such simple conviction that it really was, it helped me deal with the situation, and the aftermath as well, that I've exposed myself to all of these things that I wish I hadn't been exposed to in a lot of ways. But she's right. It can't get into you unless you let it into you.
I feel like someone listening in might be saying, okay, when you talk about the devil is real and evil is real, do you mean that the devil is a person? Do you mean that level of thing? And also, where is God in all of this as well?
Well, those are the two most difficult questions to answer. I certainly don't mean that the devil is a red hominid with hooves and horns. The devil is a spirit. How did evil come to be in the universe? Epicurus posed the question more powerfully than anybody 2,500 years ago when he said, either God can get rid of evil but chooses not to, or God would like to get rid of evil but can't. Well, if he would like to get rid of evil but can't, then he's impotent. But if he can get rid of evil and doesn't, then he's evil himself. And that has been the crux of sort of the atheist argument against God. It's been used by everyone from David Hume to Richard Dawkins as the core argument. And there's never been a fully satisfying answer from theology. The only one that is remotely sufficient, and the one I choose to operate by, even though I don't feel entirely solid, is that it's in the nature of freedom. To create a universe that is truly free, God had to allow all possibilities, and those possibilities had to stretch across the cosmos into the supernatural realm as well. So if there are angels, and I think there are, then one could have chosen separation. I mean, John Milton's line, which is the best description of Satan's philosophy, is that, it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. So that explanation is the only one that I can deal with, I guess, that satisfies me to any degree. But even though I still have to struggle with but why, would we have to have evil? But I think that the theologians who say there could be no true freedom and free will unless you could choose anything, serial killers who do these heinous things, a human being can go to that depth or, degree of separation. So I have to assume that's true in the spiritual realm also.
I want to ask you about evil within us as well, right? Like, it's not simply this force operating out there. There's some passage in the book where you say something like Satan's best work, in a way, is in the pettiness, in the unkindness that we show each other.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of the way I spoke to my 10-year-old this morning, right? It was frustrating me. And so that is also on the spectrum of evil, right?
I referred to that, but I didn't write a book about it because that book's already been written, and brilliantly, by C.S. Lewis.
Screwtape Letters, you mean?
Yes. But it was something that I was forced to contemplate. And a moment that came when really I felt confronted by it was, I did explore the cases of these two serial killers. One, because he was the one who convinced me that, there is evil. There is no other word for him and what he's done but evil. The other did absolutely heinous things, evil things also. But at the end of his life in prison, first he chose to be executed. He refused to do anything to draw it out and was taking the position that I can never be fixed and I'm a danger to the whole world. All you can do with me is kill me. The better I'm gone, the better for the world. But he supposedly had this conversion to Christianity. I had heard about it, read about it. And I was so troubled by the idea that I found the chaplain who had ministered to him in the penitentiary and who had been with him there all the way, including at the end as he was preparing to be executed. And he was telling me that this person who had done unspeakable things, by the end, he was clean as anyone you'll ever meet. He was completely free of sin because he'd admitted everything, and he was ready to meet God, as more ready than you and I are. And he said, "You just can't believe that, can you?" And I said, "Well, it's very difficult for me to believe that somebody who did what he did could ever come back." And even though I resisted, I realized at some point, well, if I don't allow the possibility that this person could have been saved, then in a way, I'm canceling the possibility of my own salvation. So I felt I had to, not rule it out, because I was ruling myself out if I did,
I want to ask, how has writing these books changed you?
Well, The Miracle Detective, the experiences were transformative, and writing the book, it certainly changed my public image and what people thought of me and saw me as, for the better in my eyes. Although, like I said, there are a lot of people who roll their eyes or scorn it, or, I'm not as much fun to be around, after I became a Christian in their eyes. But, it's something that I feel enormously pleased and proud of having done. This book was something I felt I had to do, that I was being called to do, even though I can tell you most of the time I felt like I was just groping in the dark. And a lot of time I was saying, why me? I'm not qualified to do this. I mean, there's somebody else that should be writing this book. And I kept trying to avoid it. But, I'm glad I did it, because I felt I had to do it. And I had to make that statement about the presence of evil in the world. And it wasn't something I took joy in doing, but it was something I felt, I guess I took a kind of satisfaction. I felt I've done my duty. I mean, that's how I really felt, like I was talking to God and saying, okay, I've done my duty. I'm not going to do anything like this ever again, so don't ask me.
And what do you hope for the book? What kind of conversations do you want people to have?
Well, I want people to start to talk about a recognition that evil, it does exist in the world. It's an unavoidable fact. You can't pretend it's sick or twisted or, any of those cliche words. It's evil. And so at least talk about where evil comes from. I mean, the fact that evil exists, there's got to be an ontology to evil, just like there is to everything. Where did it come from? And what other explanation can there be than that there is some spirit of evil in the universe that feeds off it and encourages it? And, what struck me especially, I mean, I don't know if you're having the same experience in Australia, but the United States is the most divided, the most polarized, the most angry at each other it's ever been. I mean, a civil war is not an unrealistic possibility. There's that much hatred between the two sides, and we're almost split down the middle. It's a sort of a frightening time for someone who's basically a political centrist like I am. But it struck me that if people realized that they had a common enemy, one who thrives on all this hatred that they feel for each other, it might do some good. It might bring some peace, because we're feeding that entity, that evil. And it's not on our side. It's not on either side. It's against us all. Evil is a fact. And supernatural evil is a fact also. To pretend otherwise puts us completely at the mercy of that force. So we have to know it exists. I'm not saying we have to, think about it too much, get involved with it. In fact, I'm ready at this point in my life to not think about the devil very much, because I thought about him a lot in the course of writing this book. But I'm even more certain that there is, in fact, a devil, that there is this force out there that would like to corrupt me and every one of us, and that is working constantly to do so. I'm not going to live my life in fear of it, but I am going to live my life in recognition of it.
You described before that writing this book was like, I've done my duty and I would like to retire from that right now. But I wonder if you can speak to any kind of godlike help that you had along the way, you know, a sense of protection, I suppose, because especially you were delving into some dark places and stories.
Yeah, I did feel that. And, I felt it in the moments when I was most vulnerable and most terrified. But I felt someone steadying me. And it wasn't it wasn't like anyone appeared to me or I heard a voice, but I did sort of hear a voice. I mean, I felt this reassurance. And I'm not a Marian Catholic, I'm not like a big devotee of the Virgin Mary, even though Medjugorje is all about that. But in those most terrifying moments in Mexico, I was thinking about her and I was asking her to be there with me. And I did feel, I don't know how to describe it, it's just sort of a calming embrace and basically a reminder it can't get into you if you don't let it into you. But I mean, also we were in situations where we both thought we were going to die, but it was like it somehow got deflected. I don't know how else to describe it. It was as if the people that might have killed us, that area is controlled by the Zetas cartel, who are about as murderous as any group of human beings on the planet. But it seemed almost like they got diverted, like their attention got diverted or something. I could feel them thinking about killing me. And it was as if they just seemed like they got distracted and didn't notice me. And that happened a couple of times in ways that I was just grateful it happened and I wanted to get out of there. But it did feel as if somebody was intervening.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
A big thank you to Randall Sullivan, who was so interesting to talk to. I'm going to post links to the book, The Devil's Best Trick, How the Face of Evil Disappeared, as well as to Randall Sullivan's earlier book, The Miracle Detective. Now, I did want to post the Wired article about Michelle Gomez, the world's best bounty hunter, that went along on some of Randall's adventures, but I'm very sorry it is paywalled, so we can't do that.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone you think might get something out of it too. And leave us a rating or review. It really does help others discover Life and Faith. As always, a big thank you to our producer, Helen Douthwaite. Next week, we want to be creating cultures and environments where boys and young men are more likely to grow into the kind of person you'd want to be around if you were a teenager, a child, a woman, or indeed another man.